Yeah, we are delighted to have Dr. Uddipana Goswami, who is currently a faculty at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, who has kindly agreed to deliver a book talk on her most recent work, which is an outcome of a Fulbright project at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. We are thankful that many of you could join, not only from different places in India, but also from abroad, including Oman, who, as I mentioned a while ago, happened to be my host family in UPenn in Philadelphia. The format that we'll follow today is that we'll have Uddipana talk for around 35 to 45 minutes, after which I'll flesh out, some of the issues that she raised, as well as from my limited reading of our book. And we'll open up the floor for question and answers, depending upon the number of questions we have. The Q&A session would stretch, accordingly. So the floor is yours, Uditpana. Please feel free, to take your time. Yeah, for 35 to 45, even 50 minutes would do for us. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you really for inviting me to the university virtually. That's the good thing about COVID, that we can do this across distances, right? And I'm very happy to talk about my book because this book is really special to me. It's kind of it's become kind of like the culmination of all the work that I have been doing so far. And then it's also sort of drawn a map for me moving forward. Like, I know now what I want to do moving forward and how I'm going to build on this particular book. So since this is a book talk, I want to talk very broadly today about three things: why this book exists, where it exists, and so what, that now that it exists. So to start with the why, this book actually started from a place of anger. When I was working on my first book, Conflict and Reconciliation, The Politics of Ethnicity in Assam, which was published in 2013. That was the outcome of my PhD research and other additional research that I had done around that time. And I was working in Assam and making these trips all over the Northeast, meeting people in the conflict zone, and I saw how women were participating in all these social movements. I heard about their contributions. I read about it. I talked to them about it, and they had played amazing, powerful roles in all these insurgency movements, all these social movements that were happening everywhere. So talking to them really, inspired me a lot. And some of their narratives actually were fictionalized, and they informed my short story collection, No Ghosts in the City, which we were talking about some time back. So these women were doing such great work. They had great hopes for the future once the peace talks started, once the treaties were signed, once the fruits of conflict started getting redistributed. But when that really happened, I saw that the women were totally sidelined. They were totally marginalized. And in all the public platforms of political reconstruction and reconciliation, the women were totally absent. And that made me very angry. And two reasons. The men, I thought, were marginalizing the women, and the women also seemed very complicitous. Like all wars, all politics, of course, it's informed by masculinized hope, masculinized humiliation. They are men's wars. It's men's politics. And ethno-nationalist conflicts are also men's wars. And they set the agenda, they decide the course, they decide the trajectory, they bring in the actors, they are the ones who act. And of course, the women are there as force multipliers. And they can't do without the women because they need them to be the caretakers. They need them to be, to act as shields with the security agencies. They need them to be couriers. They need them for so many different things. But the women would not be allowed in the decision-making process. And when the elections came, when the men who had rebelled against the state were participating in the affairs of the state now, and they were going to make a difference, it was all men, and there were only a very few token women. In fact, in the Boro movement, which was like what I was mostly concentrating on and looking at, during the first elections to the BTC, the Boroland Territorial Council, there was not a single woman who was given a ticket to fight the elections. So yeah, I thought the women were left without agency and they were marginalized. And I thought the women were okay with it, that they were complicit in their own marginalization. Because when I spoke to them, spoke to some of them, they were like, it's okay, we were financially compensated, right? So yeah, like I said, that made me very angry. And that is why I applied for the Fulbright, and that is why I went to the US to give myself that physical distance that you need sometimes to take a critical look at your context where you are so immersed in, and then to process your emotions, your anger. And I'm glad that I did that, because when I reflected from the distance, when I looked through my field notes now, when I reevaluated them, when I went through the interviews that I had done with the women once again, I started recalibrating my stance, and a very different story emerged. And that is the story that goes into this book. So I realized that what was happening is that I was looking at the margins from outside in. So even though I was in the field, right, I was when I was collecting material for this book since 2011, I was in Assam, in the Northeast, and I was working among the women. I was, taking all these trips to all these places and meeting them, and constantly thinking about this book. And while I was doing that, I realized that I was actually, even then, looking at them as an outsider. And when I say that, I mean, me being this person who had been away from this region for a long time. I was in Delhi for about 15 years before that. I was safe. I was away from the conflict zone, whereas there were these women who were in the thick of conflict, who had to go through the worst of it, and they were dealing with it, right? So how were they dealing with it? And I had to look at that. I had to look beyond my privileges. I had to understand my own positionality before I could understand what this complicity was all about. Was it really complicity? Were they really silenced and without agency, or had I missed something? So I asked these questions, and as I continued to ask these questions, my study started evolving into a broader exploration of gendered power, not just of women's agency in the conflict areas, and how can women have agency really, or can they have agency in a society where hypermasculinist structures enabled different kinds of violence every day? And this violence is personal, it is political, it ranges from intimate partner violence to genocide to ethnic cleansing, and it was all connected. I had to extricate myself from that web of interconnection. And I had to look at it from the outside in order to gain that broader perspective. And that is where being away from Assam really helped. And excuse me. And so as I examined this larger matrix of hypermasculinist violence, I also started finding myself drawn to look at not just the women, but also the other marginalized entities in the conflict zone. For example, the migrants, specifically the migrants, the Muslim migrants from East Bengal. And I was looking at their agency or their lack of it, their and of course their interaction with this web of violence that I talked about earlier. So I was also questioning at the same time, how were all these marginalized entities, whether it's the women, whether it's the migrants, how are they resisting? How are they making change? How are they making peace? Because I realized they were, and they are, right? And I won't go into the details of the how here, because that is not the purpose of this talk. But I'll just say two things here. I found two things. One is that societies like that of Assam, that have faced protracted violence, militarization, and a history of human rights abuse, where violence is normalized, such societies become criminalized, they become brutalized, they become dehumanized. Violence becomes a way of life rather than peace being a way of life. And secondly, in order to survive in such a society, to even create a semblance of peace for yourself and the people around you, you devise coping mechanisms. These might include complicitous ways of living. So you adopt the violent ways of life, or you silently, non-confrontationally resist, like the women are doing, like the migrants of Assam are doing. And I go into all of this in details in the book. And the end result of such silent, non-confrontational, but very powerful ways of resisting helps you strengthen yourself from within. It creates solidarities between the marginalized constituencies, and the outcome may or may not create huge, spectacular political changes, but you will definitely make slow change. You will bring slow peace. And the good news, which I found from my work, from my research and my study, is that such change, such slow change, slow peace, is also sustainable because it is organic, because it comes from within the communities. And that is where my book ends. But of course, not my talk, because I also promised to talk about where this book is situated. And if I were to talk about the where, I would have to situate my book in the vast literature, on conflict, on gender, peace, geopolitics, very interdisciplinary that way. But very specifically, like the specific location of the book is Assam, which is at the heart of Northeast India, which is located at the place where the three Asias meet, South, East, and Southeast Asia. So the question that I ask and I answer for myself and for my readers in the book is, why study Assam? Why connect it to this larger geopolitical canvas? Why talk about peace in Assam? Why do we need peace in Assam? And why do we need this kind of slow, organic, sustainable peace? What is wrong with, the peace, quote unquote, peace that we have now, where, the insurgent groups are all under ceasefire. Everybody is just waiting to go onto the negotiation table, and we're just waiting it out. So I started looking at Assam as a textbook case for studying conflict-habituated and violent geopolitical peripheries globally. I've already spoken about the conflict-habituatedness of this place and what it does to the people and to entire societies and communities. So finding peace in such societies is very important for those societies themselves, because you don't want to be dehumanized. You don't want to dehumanize others. You don't want to be brutalized, right? But finding peace in Assam and challenging and changing the hyper-masculinist structures of direct violence, of structural violence, of cultural violence, that is also crucial, not just for the state of Assam, but for the entire Northeast. Because if we just look at what is happening inside Assam right now, I'm sure a lot of the news trickles outside of Assam, more than definitely, how it used to go out earlier during the height of insurgency. We always used to laugh at that, because if we didn't laugh, we would cry. If there was a bomb blast back home, and we were students in Delhi at that time, so if there was a bomb blast back home, the news would be a ticker at the bottom. At best, it would be a ticker at the bottom of the news screen, right? But things have changed. News does trickle out now, and for those from outside of Assam, you might have heard about the most recent incident of border skirmishes, for example. They call it border skirmishes, but there's more to it, of course. So this happened very recently, a few months back. The Shillong Literature Festival was happening. I was supposed to go there. The car was waiting downstairs. I was just leaving when I got a call saying, "Stay where you are. There's been, trouble at the border, and don't leave. Okay, the border has been sealed." So there were incursions. There were allegations of incursions. There were firing, shooting, and a lot of that has to do with the kind of hyper-masculinist violence that the current state of Assam is seeing. And it's not just that. It also happened in the Mizoram border earlier. So whatever is happening within Assam has, repercussions, reverberations in the neighboring states. So we need to find peace here. And if we find peace in Assam, then there's peace in the rest of the Northeast as well. Peace, like conflict, also spills over, right? And so finding peace is crucial to making peace in the Northeast. Sustaining peace in the Northeast is of particular interest to the whole trans-border, transnational neighborhood. This is a hugely connected region. Despite the colonial redrawing of maps, despite the redistribution of ethnic communities, cultures, and ways of life across international borders. So historically, culturally, ethnically, demographically, ecologically, what happens inside the Northeast impacts what's happening in this trans-border region. So when we talk about Asia's arc of instability, which stretches from the Asian countries to the South Pacific region, it actually begins here in the Northeast. So if you think about how the insurgent groups of the Northeast use this this connectivity, right, this historical connectivity for arms training and weapons acquisition, you would know what I'm talking about. If you think about how, say, for example, there's disturbance in Burma's Chin province, and that spills over into Mizoram. The population movement, the cross-border army incursions, all of that. Think about how the people in all these areas have been living with such militarization, with such violence and economic marginalization for decades now. And then consider how, in the absence of peace, projects like, say, India's Kaladan multimodal project or China's Belt and Road Initiative, which are aimed at economic development and connectivity, they will never really succeed. So I start in this book by talking and thinking about peace in Assam. And not just peace as an absence of violence, but organic peace, where peace is a way of life. So there's positive peace and there's negative peace. There's the signing of treaties, there's ceasefire, there's disengagement from violence. So that is where peace is defined as an absence of violence. But you know, if there is no positive peace, then recidivism becomes a reality. Recurrence of violence becomes a possibility. Mutation of violence becomes, almost a certainty, because the structures and the cultures of violence remain. It's only the manifestations that change. So again, I was talking about what's happening within Assam today. So when we look at Assam today, we don't have secret killings like we did at the peak of emergence, of insurgency. What we do have, what's happening now, are police encounters, right? Anybody can be killed. You don't have ethnic cleansing, maybe, but there are all these eviction drives which you definitely read about every few months almost. So unless these structures change, we cannot have positive peace. And positive peace is feminist peace. It is peace which is based on social justice, which is based on an equitable redistribution of power and access. It is intersectional peace. It is not a condition where, let's say, one community wins their rights through political agitations and social movements and insurgency, conflict, and then they form their own government, and then they marginalize other communities. So it is a kind of peace where every individual of every community enjoys their rights, irrespective of caste, class, gender, ethnicity, or place of origin. And every marginalized community stands in solidarity with the other. So, this means making peace mutually. So the problem, however, is determining how you get there, how you get there from here. Here being this current reality of conflict habituation, of brutalization, dehumanization, and there here being this condition of understanding that marginality is relative, it is relational, and we constantly need to check our privileges, and we constantly need to guard against perpetuating violence towards other human beings. And because my book addresses this problem and explores this possibility in the context of Assam, it finds a home within the emerging literature on feminist peace research. In fact, it is the first in Routledge's series on advances in feminist peace research. So feminist peace research is this emergent discipline within peace studies, which it's been around for a while. I mean, you cannot talk about peace studies without referring to somebody like, say, Cynthia Enlow or Betty Reardon. But it was very recently, in about 2016, I want to say, when they actually got together as a collective and created this feminist peace network. So my book is actually, it belongs in that context. So now to go to the third question that I began with, the so what, so that the book is out, the book is out there now in the world, so what? That's the question. What does it hope to achieve, right? Where do we go from here? So for one, my goal with undertaking this project was to place the conversation about peace in Assam and in the Northeast within the global and transnational feminist networks, especially within Asian feminisms. and to challenge the marginalization of the voices from the periphery within these feminist solidarities. So, when, for example, Asian feminists talk about transborder mobilization and organizing, the border areas are often overlooked. Who's talking about gender power, peacemaking in Mizoram or Manipur or even in Assam on the platforms that have been created by transnational feminist movements in Asia? Where is, let's say, the focus on the Rohingya women and the role that gender plays, gendered power plays in the everyday violence they face? Or when, let's say, South Asian feminists talk about women's issues, why is the focus so prominently on the feminist movements in the heartland? So this is not to say that they're not aware or they do not tip their hat now and then to the feminist voices from the periphery, but more needs to be done. And the voices that are coming out, and these are very strong voices. There are so many scholars I could name who are working on feminist peace, sorry, who are looking at, who are using the feminist lens to look at peace and conflict in the area. But they are very rarely amplified or given center stage. Where they are given space, perhaps, is in narrativizing women's lives and accomplishments, their role in the conflict, and their contributions and so on. But that's women's studies, which is equally important, equally relevant, but unless you understand what makes women women, or what subjects them to the kind of aggressive machismo that relegates them to marginalized, violent, and violated spaces. In other words, unless you understand the gendered aspect of conflict and violence and what is it that shapes masculinity, that informs hypermasculinist violence in these spaces, how do you change women's lives? How do you end violence, whether it is against men or women or any other gender besides? How do you bring peace? How do you ensure equity, social transformation? So this book advances, or rather, it advocates for using a gendered lens to study violent societies in order to transform the violent structures and cultures that inform direct violence in its many forms. It tries to fill that gap where the voices from the periphery are very rarely heard. And when they are heard, if they are heard, they're only very faintly and marginally heard. And it advocates for building connections. And these connections, could be like solidarities between the feminist solidarities globally across borders. These connections could be disciplinary and discipline-bound approaches between the disciplinary and discipline-bound approaches to peacemaking, because we all know conflicts are not unidimensional, so peace also cannot be thought, it has to be thought about in multiple ways and through using multiple lenses. And mostly, though, what this book seeks to do is to establish connections between the many margins in societies which are fragmented, which are violent, which are ethnically diverse, which are conflict habituated. And it hopes that these connections will help realize peaceful solidarities that will resist where resistance is called for, when resistance is called for, and that, we will all build peace mutually and constantly, because it's iterative. It's something that has to be done over and over again till we get it right. So yeah, that's all I have to say about the book.
Okay. Thank you, Uddipana, for that very eloquent presentation of the context and the details, some of the snippets of the book that is before us. Uh, Let me raise a couple of issues, so that it would be a kind of icebreaker for the participants of this online talk, so that more questions might emanate from your presentation as well as the points that I raise. One of the things that you pointed out very pointedly in the book is the necessity or desirability of engendering, as it were, uh, uh, which, as you said, involve two simultaneous processes. One is to locate so-called quote unquote invisible women and reclaim their activities, experience, and understanding, right? And the second you said is reconstruction of a gender-sensitive theory and practice, which in effect take into account the marginalities of women's experience in peripheral regions like Northeast India. I think that is a very very valid point, and that is something which is very pertinent to the question at hand, which is essentially that you talk about multiple margins or marginalities, not only in the context of Northeast India. You say that there are margins within the mainstream and there are also centers within the margins, as it were. Right? So, in order for us to have a more engendered understanding of how peace or conflict might unraveled in marginalized space like Northeast India, to what extent do you think that this idea about margins or the centers of margins in the marginal space or peripheral place should be engaged in ways which have a more capacious engagement with the problem of hyper masculinity, or the problematic positionality from which one gaze or look at the ways in which these asymmetrical powers, that in effect got entwined with the way in which conflict unravel in those places got enacted out. That's one issue, right? The second issue, which I think is also very important, is that when you talk about the margins vis-a-vis the mainland or the centers within the margins, one of the things that is uh, conspicuous in a work is which is conspicuously absent in your work, and which I think you might like to think is the fact that given that your work is not confined just to Assam, but also forays into Nagaland and Mizoram, as you claimed in the book, some of these interesting feminist works, especially through the English fiction, the novels, the work of Temsula Au, for example, is conspicuously missing in your work. And in fact, I have this work of hers, these hills, these hills called home. Which in fact is rich in some of the complicated as well as the marginal experience of women as the victims of violence, for example. So if you were to bring in, some of the margins within this marginalized, discourse in Northeast India, what do you think would be the implication that entails in terms of the contents or the reflexivity that you tends to bring in, in terms of having a more rounded understanding of how these complex, gender dynamics might play across time as well as across space, which are riven with, complex conflict dynamics. That's another. The third, which is somehow related, is the fact that you also point and allude to the fact that conflict has become habitual, as it were, right? So, in order to break this impasse, as it were, you also, in effect, invoke the importance of reflexivity, by in effect underscoring the fact that this has to be strategically radical in terms of its orientation, in terms of its outlook, both at the ideational level, but also in terms of the experiential, networks that come into play in order to have a more capacious engagement with the problematics in the ground. So, to what extent do you think that factoring into account some of these interesting dynamics of conflicts, not just in Assam but in Nagaland, in Mizoram at one point of time, or of course in Manipur, would in effect, you know, inform the way in which this reflexivity of the strategic radical kind that you talk about might entail for a more gendered peace in conflict societies like Northeast India. So that's the third point, right? And the fourth and the final is I'm impressed by your courage as well as your forthright way in which you use autoethnography as a way to reflect on the complex dynamics of how the complicated gendered conflict dynamics in Northeast India. And I really commend you for that fortitude as well as the courage that you bring to the table, by deeply reflecting on your personal experience at home, the domestic violence that you have to encounter, and how the invisibility of women's issues, the rights, the issues around conflict, which are multiple and multi-level, have deeper implication on how we might face and encounter in ways that bring more sensitivity, but also have a more nuanced understanding of how this might play out, not only at the personal level but also at the societal level at large. So I think if you could, bring that out as well, and how that really help you navigate, the kind of the inquiry or the kind of problematics that you face in the ground, would I think would be illuminating, so that people would be provoked more to ask and engage you more fruitfully in the course of this Q&A session. With this very brief word, I would I invite you to respond to some of the points that I raised, if you will, and maybe thereafter open up the floor for more questions from the participants.
Okay. Thank you for these questions and raising these issues. I must say, you you had said that you haven't read the book. You've just skimmed through it, but you seem to have gotten most of what I was aiming at. So, thank you for this deep engagement. And to respond to your points, I have just taken some notes, but I might have to, come back to you for some clarification at some point. But let me start with this question of engendering. So, like you pointed out, engendering is not just reclaiming the invisible women and their histories. It's also about constructing a new gendered theory and a new gendered practice, right? And this, I feel, and this is something that I have brought out in the book as well, is something that is most, I don't want to use the word effectively, but maybe that is the condition of marginality, because it is in the margins that you have all these possibilities. And that's something that Bell Hooks has said over and over again, that margins are places of huge possibilities. It is while staying within these margins that you can, because you're away from the public platforms, you're away from the public eye, you're away from all that activity around you, all that busyness. You are within the margins, so you have that space for reflection. You have that space for thinking about your condition. So I feel like it is from within the margins that these engendered histories have to emerge, that these engendered theories have to be made, and that is where it is being made and practiced. everywhere in the world, whether you talk about Black feminists, whether you talk about indigenous feminists, global feminists, everywhere. That's what they are doing. So marginality is actually not a place where there is no agency. It is, in fact, a place where you have silent agency, and that is what I have talked about in the book. That the women that I talk about, they, for example, they are engaging in, and there are lots of these vignettes that I have in the book about women who are making a difference, who are bringing about ethnic reconciliation between their communities, who are changing gendered expectations, who are challenging, taking on gendered expectations head on and changing traditional gendered roles. And in the process, they are making all these changes. And if they were out there in the public platforms where the men are so busy, trying to redistribute the fruits of conflict, where they are, there's this scramble for power, right? Maybe they could not have done that. So it is for the people within the margins to do this. Usually what happens when we talk about domination, or we resist domination, what we do is we do it from, we are usually speaking to the dominator. So the idea here is to speak to the dominated, and the dominated speaking to the dominated. So creating solidarities and thinking through your own positionality. And that's where reflexivity and the reflexive praxis also comes in. Your second question was, I think, is also, the answer to that is also related to this, where you talked about how do you engage with hypermasculinity within the margins. Did I get that right? Or was, yeah. So again, later you talk about strategically using reflexive praxis, and that is something that I end the book with. I think it's all connected. That is how you, using this silent, cautious radicalism. And this is something that I borrow from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her way of functioning. And I've written about that here. When radicalism is called for, we engage in that. When we have to take to the streets, we take to the streets, right? There is no two ways about that. But there are times when we can also be cautiously radical. There are times when we can also silently, use our agency to make change without being confrontational. And that might sound like you are being complicitous. That might look like for me, that's what it looked like, right? When I said I started this book from a place of anger because I thought these women were being complicitous in their own marginalization, I did not realize that really what they were doing was they were silently resisting. They were non-confrontationally resisting. And you can do that. You can do that you can adopt that as a strategy. You can use that very strategically. It might not, lead to, quick changes, very fast moving changes. But like I said in my talk, it will lead to slow peace. It might be slow, it might be, but even if it's slow, it will be organic, it will be positive, it will be from within the communities, strengthening the communities. So strategic use of cautious radicalism in conflict-habituated societies is what I advocate, because also the other thing there is that it is a violent society. It is a brutalized society. And we all know what's happening around us, how we cannot speak up today because, there are all these laws that can be invoked. People are incarcerated for writing social media posts. So how do you handle that? How do you function in such a society? How do you think about change, about bringing about peace in such a society? How do you resist, right? So that is where that silent agency that I'm talking about, that is where that non-confrontational strategy that I'm talking about comes in. And that is how we need to change these hypermasculinist structures by changing, maybe one structure at a time, one person at a time. Slow, like I said, but sustained. And this is the other two questions about the creative works of Temsulao and the other writers in the Northeast. I did start by talking about the creative writing and the women's narratives that are being read widely on the mainland, and how there's been a lot of focus on that. And that's a great sign, because that's, that's about building bridges between the mainland and the periphery. That's about understanding, or that's about allyship. That is about reaching out to the people, between the people of the mainland and the periphery. But I hear you when you say that this needs to be explored more, that we can use these creative works and think about how they have been contributing towards building these bridges, right? Towards making these changes, towards towards making people understand what the condition of the people within the margins is like, and how the margins within the margins are functioning, how the centers are being created, etc., etc. All that I talk about in the book. But yes, that is not something that I have dealt with in details in my book. And that is one of the things that I would like to pursue at a later stage. I had begun my talk saying that this book has given me a lot to think about, and it's also sort of drawn a map for me to follow in my future research trajectory. So that is definitely one of the things that I would love to explore. Thank you for bringing that up. And it is something that I have been, writing about off and on, about literature of witness, about, how the writer, the social responsibility of the writer in the periphery, and so on. And in fact, my next book, another collection of short stories. I am myself taking on that role of the writer who is the chronicler of conflict, and who is thinking through creative writing as one of the, a creative, not just creative writing, but the arts and literature and public-facing writing and all of that. How that is also another way of non-confrontational, cautious radicalism. So that is something that I talk about in the last chapter of my book, how the writers, the intellectuals, the thinkers, how they should be engaging, with conflict within this very hyper-masculinized margin. And the last question that you raised about autoethnography and the many violences that women face, and how did I navigate through that? So yeah, I skipped on that part a little when I was talking about why I wrote this book and how I ended up writing this book. So at one point I had spoken about how I recalibrated my approach to the women in the field, and how I sort of thought through my anger against them, which is directed at them, and what made me change my mind. So one of the things that made me change my mind really was my own experience, which is that I had, while I was working on this book, I was going through this, I had just escaped from a very violent and abusive marriage. And it's still ongoing. The harassment, everything is ongoing. But I'm doing my work. I am silently, non-confrontationally, I am working on what I have to work. I'm making whatever contribution I need to make. And when I started thinking about that, and this happened, like I said, when I gained that critical distance from my immediate physical context, when I was in the US, I started thinking about all of this. And this made me, actually, this was the lens that I used to, this autoethnographic lens is what I used to look back at the women. When I started, re-looking at my field notes, when I started, sort of replaying those interviews that I did with them, that is when I realized that there is, agency in silence. There is agency in non-confrontation as well. There is, you don't need external validation. And that's what these women were really doing. And that is when I could step out of my, of this very privileged understanding or this privileged perspective that I was holding on to in terms of thinking about the women in the conflict zone. And I also realized that despite everything that I had gone through, I was better off because I didn't have to go through, personal as well as political violence. I did not have to, face violence at home as well as outside of the home, right? So how did these women cope with that? How have they made change? How have they made peace despite all of that? That is what really motivated this book. I hope I have addressed everything that you wanted to
Yeah,
know.
fair enough. Yeah, Uddipana, thank you so much. More power to you, and we hope we'll get to see more of your reflexivity into play in your next project.
Thank you.
May I now open the floor for questions? If any one of you have any question to raise to the speaker today?
Hi,
Yeah,
Swan.
Manjari, please go ahead.
And I had, just a couple of, questions out of curiosity, nothing much. But at the outset, I want to congratulate Uddipana for the wonderful book she's come out with. And I mean, I haven't sort of gone through it, but definitely after listening to her, I would like to sort of buy the book and see whatever you have talked about, read about it as well. I just wanted to draw your attention, Uddipana, to the feminist peace project that you talked about and you're a part of. Just, since you've closely looked at and studied the marginalities, the gendered marginalities in conflict zone, particularly Assam, I mean, you have actually the group, the whole project has highlighted the women's voice there, the victimhood there, the pain and suffering of women, not only as passive receivers of violence, but also actively sort of trying to bring about resolutions, reconciliations, peace, etc. In this context, I just I'm just curious that is this able to sort of generate a feminist, very openly radically feminist consciousness in them, or sort of what you've seen is more of an activity which is like coming from members of the society, members of the community, members of the families who have suffered this pain. So I just want to draw your attention to the distinction. Whether women are participating as active agents and becoming conscious in a feminist way, or their whole role is more as members of violent society, who have suffered the members of communities who have suffered violence, members of families who have suffered violence. So that's my first question. The second question is that just drawing your attention to also the linkages, the solidarity between the different marginalized strains. I mean the various marginalized sections, because we know that the othering is not only a gendered othering, but also sort of a what we read, we have seen the citizenship othering, which is the majoritarian othering which is going on. So what are the linkages between these two? Because when we talk about one, we cannot ignore the other. I mean, since you have also raised the whole issue about several marginalities which have come up and which are there, which keep changing, but they remain constant in the sense that if certain reconciliations happen, the others come up. So links between the different kinds of othering which is going on. So your thoughts on that? Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that is something that I really grappled with when I was writing the book. Both these issues that you have raised. One is whether there is this radically feminist consciousness among the women, whether the fact that they are making these changes, is it just because of their situatedness in the conflict, in the context of conflict, in the conflict zone, or is there any chance that they might mobilize into a feminist movement in the future? They haven't yet. And I realized that it is maybe not possible in the current environment of violence and conflict habituation, the kind of fragmentation that we see, and this narrative of fear, and this also links to the second question that you asked, the solidarities across marginalities. Is it happening? It is not happening. It is not. It is under, even if it would have happened under other conditions, this narrative of fear, of othering, the public rhetoric that we have around us, the actions of the state that we see, these violences that we experience and we witness all the time, it is not allowing any form of mobilization among the women. It is not allowing for any kind of solidarities to develop between the different marginalized entities. So that is the crux of the book, that this is not happening, and what can we do to make that happen? And just because it is not happening, does it mean that there's no value to what is actually happening in the margins, right? So in case of the women, I see this as a feminist moment, not a conscious movement, but a feminist moment that is making these changes silently. And it has its own value, right? If we look into how they are making this change. For example, I talked about cautious radicalism earlier. The need, their complete disregard for the need for external validation. So if we look at them, if we analyze them, if we reflect on these changes and the way they are operating within these conditions of hypermasculinist violence in the margins, we realize that there are lots of lessons to be drawn from there, and that, for me, is the importance of these moments, right? So there are multiple moments there. For example, the men who are leading these public processes of conflict, political reconstruction, and conflict transformation. If you look at what's happening there, you always see this constant need for external validation, this constant need for, waiting for, the central government to dole out all, whatever the perks that they need, whatever the rewards of having gone through all the conflicts and all the movements. So, but these women are doing it without any such expectation, without any such need for external validation. So maybe, strengthening from within is something that we need to do in the margins, and without really being outward looking in that sense. That is one. And secondly, how the other thing that I brought out in the case of the migrants in Assam, was how they all banded together, how the entire community, came together, helped each other out during the whole NRC process. And it's a community where very few people are educated, and they do not have the means, and most of them do not have the means and the resources required. I mean, I'm from the dominant community in Assam, and I know what trouble my family went through to collect all the documents. And then I think about a community which has to be constantly mobile, right? Which is displaced all the time, which faces all these different challenges at every step. How much more difficult it must have been for them to collect the documents, to fill up those tedious forms, and the entire process, the whole bureaucratic machinery, and navigating through all of that. And they did it, right? The students' organizations got together. There were private individuals who created these collectives, and they all worked together. So much so that the expectation, which was that many of them will be left out of the NRC, whatever, that did not happen. It happened, but not to the extent that was hoped. So that again is agency, right? That is solidarity within the community, and I want to think about how that can be extended, how all the marginalized entities, marginalized communities can get together reflexively, think about their common history. It's the same history of violence. It is the same history of disenfranchisement. It is the same history of, marginalization, of militarization that we've all faced, of displacement, and, the list goes on and on. So why cannot we all, stand in solidarity with each other? Why can't we all think about humane and fair and just policies? Why can't we push for those policies and laws which are fair to citizens, to non-citizens, to stateless people, which are fair to the indigenous and the migrants and the autochthonous, everybody, right? So that is something that we need to work towards, and that, I think, is the work that I would like to see growing out of this book.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Adil, you may speak out for yourself. Yeah. Should I read out for you, Uddipana, the message, the question asked by Adil? Or Adil, would you like to come in and...
I'm just checking my chat box here. Okay. How can a research methodologically account for the gendered memories of violence and changing political subjectivity in a conflict zone over a period of time? Okay. How does one study the changing topography of memories of violence, and how much is autoethnography an accepted method in universities outside of India? Okay, thank you for that question. Sorry. As you can see, I'm just recovering from the flu, so sorry about that. Okay, I'll take that second bit first. Autoethnography as an accepted method in universities outside of India. I don't know really how much it is accepted anywhere, because traditional research methodologies tell us that, and that's what is practiced in most academic spaces everywhere, whether it's in India or outside of India. That you have to be objective, you have to be impartial. There is no space for, the researcher in the research. You cannot weave yourself into your research design and your research questions. Yeah, it cannot be subjective. So, unfortunately, no, there is not much acceptance of autoethnography everywhere, but it is not to say that it is not happening. It is happening in several spaces. And I see that changing a lot, especially in the current conversations that are happening about also decolonization and how we need to decolonize our ways of knowing and thinking, and try and look beyond the accepted, the prevalent forms of knowledge gathering, processes of ways of knowledge gathering. So there are alternate ways of looking at things that are being accepted more and more, but I feel there's a lot that's left to be done. But for myself, I feel that I feel very strongly that if I am not in my research, then if I'm not transparent about the fact that I am in my research, then I am being insincere, because research is also about power, right? We all know that. And the questioning of the power relation that is inherent in the research, the researcher and the researched, should begin with the research design itself, how we think methodologically, how we approach our research and think about, how are we going to do this? How are we going to, go out there and engage with our quote unquote subjects? Another term that I have a problem with. But yeah, research is subjective, and we have to acknowledge that. And that is happening increasingly, like I said. And that is a good sign, but more needs to be done. And even within, let's see, what's your first question? Research methodology. How can the research methodologically account for the changes? Okay, yeah, so that is another question that I have been grappling with, the changes in the conflict zone, and how do you design a research or think about it methodologically in a way that you anticipate the kind of fluidity, the kind of flux that's there in the. It's always there in any kind of any field that you go, but especially in a conflict zone. How do you do that? And that's unfortunately an answer that I really have not come up with yet, except to say that ethnography has helped me in doing that to a large extent, because you cannot really program ethnography. You have to be open to the changing circumstances in the field, and especially in a conflict zone where you might have to you have to be prepared for anything in a conflict zone. So, which is why I have relied heavily on ethnography always. But thinking in terms of gendered memories and violence and changing political subjectivity, also their feminist ethnography is what I have adopted always, and what I recommend most of my students to undertake, because that is where you are most conscious of these changing subjectivities. That is where you are most prepared to grapple with them.
Yeah, thank you, Adil, for asking that question. Anyone else? Yeah, Vishnu Priya, please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. First of all, thank you for this wonderful lecture. Like, it's very rare that we get to know about Northeast, and that too on this marginal topics about women as such. So, I have one comment to make and two questions to ask. One is uh, that is, I believe that engendering violence and peace is important. But if we equate positive peace with feminist peace, wouldn't there be any generalization thinking that women as peaceful? but only in, if we take example of only of Asian feminist literature, we can see a diversity in the kind of movements or how women are being. Like maybe a example of Naga Mothers Association, where women are very been peaceful, who have worked for peace. And the other example would be a contrast of women in LTT or Naxal movement as in India, LTT as in Sri Lanka. So, wouldn't that be this danger of generalization? And my question is how the role of state in this violent peripheries, where you have written on Assam. So, mostly, if we take 1971 war, uh, the women in Bangladesh, they are called as Bironganas, who were being raped by the East Pakistan military, and they are felicitated by the state. But again, if we take Naga Mothers Association, after the peace process has been complete, they are left out of the public sphere. And I guess only recently the first woman minister has been come up in the Nagaland cabinet, even though they had such a strong Naga peace movement by women. uh, and my second question is how this agency for women could be created. The points you have mentioned as silence, non-cooperation. The other example I can take is of nudity that has been used after the killing of Manorama in Manipur. So can songs, arts, folklore, this can be used as an agency to create more, to liberate women in these peripheries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu Priya. And I think you raise a very valid question here when you talk about, in fact, the first 2 points that you make about equating positive peace, the danger of equating positive peace with gendered peace, and then the fact that, the role that women played in all these social movements, and yet how they are left out. In fact, like I said, that was my starting point, right? That's where I started talking, thinking about this book. So we need to make this difference, understand this distinction between gender and women to start with. We cannot equate gender with women, because women's studies, women's agency, women's women's roles, it's different from thinking through these issues using a gendered lens, because when we are talking about gender, we are actually talking about hierarchies. We are actually talking about dichotomies. We are talking about, masculinized politics, and we are talking about women's roles in those in those masculinized movements, right? So we need to make that clear distinction. And when I say that positive peace is gendered peace, what I really mean is that we need to, in order to achieve positive peace, which is organic, which is entrenched in the society as a way of life, we have to challenge these entrenched structures, right? These hyper-masculinist structures, these violent structures, which marginalize not just women, but also men, right? So peace has to be intersectional. It has to be, be for everybody, for men, women, or any gender, right? It has to be for every ethnicity. It has to be for every person, irrespective of their place of origin. So in that sense, positive peace is gendered peace, right? We have to think beyond hierarchies. We have to think beyond dichotomies, because whenever there are hierarchies, whenever there are dichotomies, there is violence. And speaking about the women's roles, you bring out the pertinent example of the Biranganas. You talk about the Naga mothers and how, people are celebrating the fact that 2 women are now in the have now been elected in Nagaland, and yet their contribution to the Naga movement has been written about, talked about for so long now, because that's beyond question, right? But the fact here is that women and women's agencies have been used in all these conflicts in the Northeast, whether it's in the Northeast or in any other violent periphery, any other zone of conflict. Women are used as symbols of masculine pride. They're reduced to that symbol. So they are the ones who have to, dress a particular way, because they are the bearers of, the culture. They are the keepers of the culture. If the women are raped, it is an outrage to the community. They are the keepers of the honor of the community, which is why rape is used as a weapon of war in all these conflict zones. So when we talk about women's agency, we have to also talk about masculinity and masculinist politics, and how women are used as symbols of this masculinist pride. And we need to go, our understanding of gendered peace, our understanding of women's agencies and positive peace needs to go beyond thinking just about men versus women, to thinking in terms of like I said earlier, dichotomies, hierarchies of masculinity and femininity and all of that. And your third point about using the arts, songs, folklore, art as means of protest, definitely. And that is something that that the book talks about a lot. There was this huge controversy about Mia poetry a while back. And I think that's resistance, using language to resist. Most of the social movements that we see, most of the political agitations that have happened in the Northeast, there's always song and dance, and there's the arts. Graffiti, is art. Graffiti, you'll see all the walls plastered with graffitis. So yes, definitely. And that is what that is one of the ways in which we bring about positive slow peace, right? The slow peace that I keep talking about, because the arts are tame, right? They are, they don't immediately or very overtly tend to offend people. And you use that strategically, right? You use these art forms, you use your, art activism work as citizen artists to bring about these changes. And I teach music students currently. So I talk a lot about how music can bring about changes, the role that music has been playing in social movements globally, and the role that it can very strongly play. For example, the anti-rape song, the Chilean anti-rape song, which became the anthem of women everywhere around the world. That was a song. That was a song and dance, and it brought about an amazing feminist moment across transnational feminist moment across the globe. So, yeah, definitely.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vishnupriya, for your very probing questions. Yeah, anyone else in the floor to ask? Okay, looks like you have settled the score for now. Thank you, Uddipana. Thank you once again. Let me thank, on my personal behalf, as well as on behalf of the Department of Political Science here at the University of Hyderabad, for that very eloquent, very insightful, and thought-provocative, talk. We hope that we would one day have you on board here in the department. And to remind the participants of this online talk, Uddipana has done exceedingly well, having published 7 books already. at a very young age, and she is on the verge of completing another book, which, as he pointed out, would be on short stories. We look forward to reading your works in the coming days, Uddipana, and hope to catch you up in the offline mode very soon. With this, let me thank the participants, students of the departments, as well as outside the departments. Faculty, Professor Manjari Bhim was there, uh, and other participants, including Uman from Myanmar. I hope you should be able to catch up in Philly when you return back. And thank you once again. Uh, Uddipana will be reaching you out for some boring technical details. I hope you should be able to revert back to us. With this,